Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are tearing away the Hollywood myths surrounding the ultimate symbol of espionage, the lie detector. We're digging into a fascinating, heavily redacted, and recently declassified dossier from the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency, or NSIRA. They took a long, hard look at how Canada's Signals Intelligence Agency, the Communications Security Establishment, or CSE, actually uses the polygraph to screen its operatives. What they uncovered about what happens behind closed doors is absolutely riveting. It fundamentally challenges how we think about truth, technology, and privacy in the intelligence world.
So this brings us to the big question we really have to ask ourselves today. Can a machine actually detect a lie? I mean, if you're like most people who watch pop culture spy thrillers, you probably picture the polygraph as this infallible, almost magical device that just beeps the second a villain tells a falsehood. But as this declassified review reveals, the clinical, scientific reality of how intelligence agencies actually screen their operatives, it's vastly different from the movies. It is way more psychological and far less certain.
Let's start by defining the polygraph exactly how the government does. A polygraph isn't actually reading your mind, right? It's an examination that uses questioning techniques and technology to record physiological responses. We're talking respiration, heart rate, blood pressure, and electrodermal response, which is basically just how much your skin sweats. The whole underlying assumption here is that deception triggers a biological threat response. But as you're going to see, measuring physical stress and fear is absolutely not the same thing as measuring deception. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our mission briefing for today's Explainer. We're going to cover 1. The lie detector myth, 2. Anatomy of the exam, 3. Relevant versus comparison questions, 4. Scoring the polygraph, 5. The interrogation trap, and finally, 6. Flaws in the spy system. That's our roadmap to understanding the true anatomy of a spy agency polygraph. Starting off with Section 1, the lie detector myth, science versus fiction. It is totally critical to understand the stark divide between government claims and actual science here. While the Communications Security Establishment claims the polygraph is a scientifically objective way to assess truthfulness, NSIRA found that the broader independent scientific community heavily disputes this. Just listen to this quote from the American Psychological Association. They state, "There is no evidence that any pattern of physiological reactions is unique to deception. The lie detector might be better called a fear detector." The agency relies incredibly heavily on this machine, treating it as a vital gatekeeper for getting an enhanced top-secret clearance. Yet, and it's honestly kind of hard to believe this gets overlooked, the research shows that neurodiverse individuals, or people diagnosed with mental illness or anxiety, might show varied physiological responses that the polygraph methodology simply doesn't account for. Moving right along to Section 2, Anatomy of the Exam, the 3 stages of screening. Let's look at how the CSE actually administers this highly sensitive test to its prospective and current employees, step by step. A standard polygraph at the agency happens in 3 distinct stages. Stage 1 is the pre-polygraph interview. Here, examiners collect highly detailed biographical and medical data to figure out if the subject is medically suitable to even take the test. But here's the catch, NSIR noted, and it's actually quite shocking. These examiners have 0 medical training. None. Yet they are collecting deeply intrusive data about sleep habits, medication, and whether the subject has ever consulted a psychiatrist. Then, Stage 2 is the actual polygraph exam, where the physiological recording takes place. Finally, Stage 3 is the post-polygraph interview, where the examiner makes their initial assessment and really zeroes in on any adverse information. Which brings us to Section 3, Relevant versus Comparison Questions, the Psychological Trap. This perfectly sets us up for what actually gets asked during Stage 2. The agency uses something called the comparison question technique, and honestly, it operates as a fascinating psychological trap. Notice the extreme contrast here. The exam mixes relevant questions with comparison questions. Relevant questions are highly specific security issues, things like, have you engaged in espionage, or have you mishandled classified information? But comparison questions? Those are impossibly broad, lifelong probes into your integrity. Think of questions like, have you ever lied to a loved one, or have you ever broken a rule? The trick is that examiners don't tell the subject there's a difference. They fully expect you to react physiologically to these broad comparison questions because, well, everyone has lied at some point, right? So these broad questions serve as a baseline of anxiety to measure against the actual, real espionage questions. Next up, Section 4, Scoring the Polygraph, Measuring the Reaction. Let's see how those physiological responses translate into a final, highly classified score. It all comes down to 4 possible outcomes, based entirely on how your body reacts to those 2 different sets of questions we just talked about. Notice how a passing score, which is no deception indicated, or NDI, relies purely on a comparative physical reaction. You get an NDI if your physiological reaction to the relevant espionage questions is measurably lower than your reaction to those broad comparison questions. Conversely, if you react more strongly to the espionage questions, you score a deception indicated, or DI. Sometimes the examiner just kind of can't make a clear determination, and that results in an inconclusive score. Or if the machine malfunctions or you end the test early, it's just incomplete. Now we hit the darker reality in Section 5, the interrogation trap, when the machine fails. So, what happens when the machine fails to clear you? This is where Ansira found that the reality of the process becomes incredibly tense and adversarial. The absolutely crucial point is what occurs after a subject scores a deception indicated or inconclusive. As the report states, repetitive and aggressive questioning, often prompted by an initially negative assessment, risks causing some subjects to inadvertently fabricate information. That is a major, major concern. The review observed that friendly examiners suddenly pivoted to an aggressive, confrontational style. Faced with this unscientific assessment that they're lying, subjects are psychologically pressured. They literally begin desperately searching their memories, sometimes volunteering totally hypothetical scenarios or guessing at past information handling errors just to appease the examiner and explain away the machine's negative readings. It just turns into a stressful interrogation where the onus is entirely on the subject to clear themselves. And finally, Section 6. Flaws in the spy system, systemic and legal failures. Now, the aggressive questioning wasn't the only issue NSIRA uncovered. They documented a whole series of critical institutional and bureaucratic failures regarding how the polygraph program was actually being managed. These bureaucratic flaws are significant, so let's break them down real quick. First off, despite collecting deeply personal medical and lifestyle data, CSE had not conducted a required privacy impact assessment for the polygraph program. Second, and this is incredibly concerning, information collected during these exams was sometimes used by human resources to secretly reject candidates for general suitability, meaning candidates were dropped without officially being denied a security clearance. Why does that matter? Well, because by never officially denying the clearance, the agency effectively bypassed standard legal protections. They unfairly denied applicants their legal right under the NSIRA Act to appeal the decision. And finally, when doubts arose, the agency routinely subjected individuals to multiple stressful polygraphs rather than just conducting standard security interviews to resolve the issue. And, this all builds into a massive issue of oversight. NSIRA requested audio-visual recordings of these polygraph exams to conduct their review. Alarmingly, they found that 20%, that is 1 in 5, of the recordings they requested were completely missing or corrupted due to technical errors. It is staggering to think about. The polygraph system was reportedly struggling to record physiological data and audiovisual data at the exact same time. But regardless of the technical reason, losing 20% of these highly sensitive interrogation records, that severely damages accountability and makes any kind of independent oversight incredibly difficult. We've explored the scientific doubts, the psychological traps of those comparison questions, the aggressive interrogations, and the systemic privacy failures. The NSERI review ultimately raised serious concerns that this entire process might actually violate the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Does the pursuit of absolute security justify the violation of basic privacy and charter rights? Does an invasive, flawed machine truly belong as the ultimate gatekeeper in a modern intelligence agency? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the facts behind the fiction.